No one smiled at that wedding. The small village church was full, yet the silence weighed more than the people inside it. There were no laughs, no excited whispers, no light anticipation that usually surrounds a day like that. It felt as if everyone was there merely to fulfill an agreement, not to celebrate love. She kept her eyes lowered, holding the bouquet with trembling hands. The dress was simple, borrowed, hastily adjusted. Not because she didn't dream of something better, but because this wedding had never been a dream. It was a way out. He stood beside her, serious and distant. He didn't touch her. He didn't look at her. He seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders, like someone hiding something far too heavy to be spoken aloud. When the priest asked if they accepted the marriage, the answer came too quickly. A yes that didn't come from the heart. It came from necessity. After the ceremony, there was no celebration, only brief goodbyes and curious glances. People whispered, sensing something was wrong, but no one dared to ask. Night fell over the farm, deeper and heavier than before. In the hastily prepared bedroom, they stood a few steps apart. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady her breathing. He remained by the window, staring into the darkness outside as if searching for courage. That was when the truth began to surface. And that night, meant to seal an agreement, would become the moment everything changed forever. If you enjoy deep stories filled with emotion, silence, difficult choices, and unexpected new beginnings, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Your support truly helps this space continue to exist. If you can, leave a like. It helps this story reach more people who may need to feel something today. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you expect from this story. Do you think this marriage has any chance of turning into love? I read every comment with great care. Now, let's continue. The wind blew cold that afternoon in Willow Creek, Montana, gently stirring the simple curtains of the small church. It was a place used to modest weddings, but this one felt different. There was no joy in the air, only expectation and quiet curiosity. Grace Miller walked in slowly, holding a bouquet far too small to hide the trembling of her hands. The white dress wasn't new, nor custom-made. It had been borrowed from someone in town, altered in a rush, just like the decision that was about to change her life. She wasn't there for love. She was there because she had no other choice. At the altar, Ethan Walker waited in silence. Tall, serious owner of a vast farm on the outskirts of town, he was known for being reserved, almost unreachable. Few people knew anything about him beyond the essentials. And perhaps that was exactly what made this marriage feel so unsettling. They had barely spoken before that day. When Grace stopped beside him, she felt the distance, not just physical, but emotional. Ethan kept his gaze forward, like someone repeating to himself that this had to happen, no matter the cost. The priest began the ceremony with words about love and commitment that felt out of place. The few guests exchanged discreet glances, sensing that this yes carried no promises, only necessity. "Do you accept?" the priest asked. "Yes," Grace replied, barely above a whisper. "Yes," Ethan said immediately after, too quickly. No smiles, no lingering kiss, only the dry sound of an agreement being sealed. When it ended, people dispersed quietly. No music, no celebration, no embraces. Some whispered, others simply watched, trying to understand what had led such a fragile young woman to marry a man so closed off. The drive to the farm passed in silence. The car moved along the dirt road as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Grace kept her hands folded in her lap, her heart racing. Ethan drove with focused eyes, not saying a word. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. When they arrived, the house stood firm among the fields, beautiful, solid, and strangely cold. In the bedroom prepared for the night, they remained a few steps apart. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, trying to control her breathing. Ethan stood by the window, staring into the darkness outside. There was something he still hadn't told her, something that would completely change the meaning of that marriage. And that night, their first as husband and wife, the truth could no longer be delayed. The bedroom door closed with a soft, almost respectful sound, as if even the house knew this was not an ordinary moment. Outside, the wind made the old wooden walls of the farmhouse creak gently, and the silence that settled between Grace and Ethan felt heavier than any words could be. Grace remained seated on the edge of the bed, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The white dress was still there, now wrinkled by tension and fear. She breathed slowly, trying to convince her body that she was safe, but her heart didn't believe it. Ethan stood near the window, staring out at the dark fields stretching as far as the eye could see. For a moment, Grace thought he wanted to run, that all it would take was opening that window and disappearing into the cold Montana night. "You can," she began, her voice barely audible. "You can sit down if you want." Ethan turned slowly. His eyes met hers for the first time since they had entered the room. There was no hardness in his gaze, only conflict, a kind of exhaustion that didn't come from the body, but from the soul. He nodded silently and walked to a chair near the bed, sitting down carefully, still keeping a respectful distance between them. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Only the distant sound of crickets and the wind brushing against the house filled the space. Grace was the first to break the silence. "I know this," she hesitated, swallowing hard. "I know this isn't what either of us imagined for our lives." Ethan let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't want you to think I brought you here without caring about what would happen to you," he said at last. His voice was low and controlled, but something inside it was clearly broken. Grace lifted her eyes, confused. Then why? The question hung in the air. Why this marriage? Why the rush? Why her? Ethan fell silent again. This time, longer. He seemed to choose his words the way someone walks on unstable ground, knowing one wrong step could destroy everything. "Because I lied," he finally said. Grace felt her stomach twist. "You lied? How?" He took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep water. "I wasn't honest when I asked you to accept this marriage. I didn't tell you the whole truth about me, about what's at stake." Grace's heart began to race. "Ethan," she whispered, "what's going on?" He stood up from the chair, paced a few steps across the room, then stopped, resting his hands on the old dresser. His shoulders were tense. "A few months ago," he began, "my doctor gave me a diagnosis. Something I didn't expect. Something that changed everything." A chill ran down Grace's spine. "What kind of diagnosis?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "A degenerative illness. It's not something that will kill me tomorrow, but little by little it will take away my ability to take care of the farm, to take care of myself. Maybe sooner than I want to admit." The room seemed to spin slowly. "You're sick," Grace said, trying to organize her thoughts. "Yes," he replied. "And the farm." He gestured toward the window. "It's everything I have. Everything my family built. If I can't keep it running, it will be taken, sold, lost." Grace remained silent, absorbing every word. "And the marriage?" she asked carefully. "Where do I fit into this?" Ethan turned to her, his gaze heavy. "The land contract requires a family living here, a wife, someone who can take on certain legal responsibilities if I can't anymore." The weight of the revelation settled on Grace's shoulders. "So I'm a solution?" The word hurt more than she expected. "You're not just that," Ethan said too quickly, as if afraid of losing her in that instant. "But I know that's how it started. And I'm sorry." Grace looked away, fighting back tears. She had accepted this marriage out of necessity, yes, but she had never imagined she was stepping into something so fragile, so full of shadows. "You should have told me," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied, "but I was afraid you'd say no, afraid of being completely alone." The word alone echoed in the room. Grace stood up slowly and walked to the window beside him. She looked out at the dark fields, feeling the cold wind brush lightly against her face. "You're not the only one who's afraid," she said at last. "I am too." Ethan watched her in silence. "I have nowhere to go," Grace continued. "If I had refused this marriage, I'd be going back to a place where I'm not welcome, where I'm just a burden." He felt a knot form in his throat. "So here we are," Ethan murmured. "Two strangers, bound together by fear and necessity." Grace turned to face him. "Maybe," she said, "but that doesn't mean we have to turn this into something cruel." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean we can be honest from now on, at least with each other. No more lies. No pretending." Silence settled in again, but this time it was different. Less heavy, more reflective. "I promise," Ethan said firmly, "from today on there will be no more secrets." Grace nodded slowly. "Then let's start like this," she replied, "with the truth." They remained there for a few moments, standing side by side, looking into the darkness. Not as husband and wife in love, but as two wounded souls trying to find some kind of shelter in each other. That night, there were no promises of love, no forced gestures, only respect. And a silent agreement that, despite the lie that had brought them together, perhaps the truth could, with time, transform something within them. And as the farm slept beneath the starry Montana sky, Grace and Ethan understood that this marriage, born from a lie, had just given way to something unexpected, a chance. Grace's first week at the Walker farm passed slowly, too slowly, as if time itself had decided to watch before moving forward. Mornings began early, far too early for someone who came from the city. The sun had barely risen when the distant sound of roosters and the wind cutting across the fields announced a new day. It took Grace a few days to adjust, but she didn't complain. She had learned long before arriving there that complaining didn't change reality. It only made the wait more noticeable. She woke up in silence every morning, moved carefully through the house, avoiding unnecessary noise. Even though they slept in separate rooms, there was something about this new arrangement that kept her alert, as if any sound could break an invisible agreement between her and Ethan. The house was large, old, built of dark wood and untold stories. Every hallway seemed to hold echoes of old footsteps, laughter that no longer existed, absences that had never been filled. Grace felt this most at night, when the silence became almost physical. Ethan, meanwhile, kept a rigid routine. He left early, returned late, spoke only when necessary. He wasn't rude. He never had been. But there was a carefully constructed distance about him, like a man who had learned to protect himself from his own desires. At breakfast, they exchanged few words. Still, small gestures began to appear. Ethan always left the coffee ready. Grace wiped the table before leaving. Neither of them mentioned it, but both noticed. Little by little, Grace began to explore the farm more carefully. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and there was something solemn about that vastness. She walked slowly, observed the cattle, the barns, the fences that needed repair. She didn't understand much about that world, but she respected it. One morning, she decided to help however she could. She put on an old shirt, tied her hair back, and began organizing one of the sheds. The smell of hay and dry wood filled her senses, bringing a strange feeling, almost familiar. As if that place, though unknown, was willing to accept her. Some of the workers watched her from a distance. They whispered it was inevitable. To them, Grace was just a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and suddenly carried the Walker name. She felt their eyes on her. But she didn't shrink. She had faced worse than silent judgment. Ethan noticed everything. He always did, but he said nothing. Part of him believed Grace needed to find her own way to stand her ground there. One hot afternoon, Grace sat under the shade of an old tree to rest. She watched the farm's movement when she heard footsteps approaching. Ethan stopped a few steps away, hat in his hands. "You don't have to push yourself," he said, without accusation. "I'm not pushing myself," Grace replied. "I'm trying to understand where I fit." He remained silent for a few seconds. "This place isn't easy," he admitted. "It hasn't always been kind to me." Grace looked toward the horizon before answering. "Life hasn't been kind to me either," she said. "Maybe that's why I'm here." Ethan didn't respond, but the words stayed with him. In the days that followed, their coexistence began to change. Grace started helping in the kitchen, organizing the house, learning small farm tasks. Ethan, without realizing it, began to include her in simple decisions. He asked her opinion. He waited for her presence. One night, a storm came suddenly. The wind shook the windows. Rain pounded the ground mercilessly. Grace woke up startled, her heart racing. She had never liked storms. She got up and walked into the living room, and there was Ethan, standing, watching the rain through the window. "You can't sleep either?" she asked. "Not when the weather turns like this," he replied. They stood side by side, without touching. Thunder split the sky. Grace flinched. Ethan noticed. "You can stay here if you want," he said gently. "The storm will pass." She nodded. It was the first time they shared silence so closely. No tension, no obligation, just presence. Days later, Grace witnessed something that changed how she saw Ethan. She found him in the barn, sitting, breathing heavily, his face tense. He tried to hide it, but it was too late. "Ethan," she approached. "Are you okay?" "It'll pass," he murmured. But it didn't. Grace knelt in front of him, ignoring whatever barriers still existed between them. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she said. "Not with me." Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time, he let himself lean on her. "I used to have everything under control," he confessed. "Now, sometimes I feel like the farm is going to swallow me whole." Grace held his hand firmly. "Then don't face it alone." From that day on, something changed. Ethan began to trust more. Grace began to care more. Small gestures became routine. A plate set aside, a coat offered when the cold set in, a look that lingered 1 second longer. At night, they sat on the porch, watching the Montana sky. Grace had never seen so many stars. Ethan told stories about his father, his mother, his childhood on that very land. Grace spoke little about her past, and Ethan didn't insist. Some wounds need time. "Do you regret this marriage?" she asked once, almost in a whisper. Ethan took a long time to answer. "I regret not telling the truth from the beginning," he said, "but I don't regret you being here." Grace felt her chest tighten. It wasn't a declaration, but it was more than she expected. That night, lying in her bed, Grace realized something dangerous was happening. She was beginning to care. Not about the agreement, not about the last name, but about the man. On the other side of the hallway, Ethan was also awake, thinking about how the woman who had entered his life as a temporary solution was becoming part of the house itself. The farm felt less silent since she arrived. He knew the truth still hovered over them. He knew that when it came out, it could destroy everything. Still, For the first time in a very long while, Ethan chose not to run from what was growing there, even if it hurt later. The town of Willow Creek wasn't big enough to keep secrets for very long. In fact, it was far too small for that. Grace realized this the very first time she walked down Main Street beside Ethan. The old storefronts, the simple shop windows, the corner cafe, the grocery store that seemed older than anyone still alive. Everything there carried memory and judgment. Conversations lowered as they passed. They didn't stop completely, but they changed tone. Eyes followed them from every direction, some curious, others clearly suspicious. Grace felt the weight settle on her shoulders, as if every step was being closely observed. She didn't belong there, and everyone knew it. "They're staring," she murmured, trying to keep her posture steady. Ethan walked with firm steps, his face unreadable. "They always stare," he replied, "but today it's different." Grace understood exactly what he meant. Now she was the wife, the woman who appeared out of nowhere, the stranger who carried the Walker name without having a story in town. At the market, the silence felt even heavier. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with eyes far too attentive, looked Grace up and down before offering a polite smile. "Good morning," Grace said gently. "Good morning," the woman replied, glancing quickly at Ethan. "It's been a while since I've seen you around here, accompanied." Grace felt the comment like a small cut. "We're taking care of some farm business," Ethan said, ending the conversation. As they walked through the aisles, Grace caught whispered voices. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. That wasn't innocent curiosity. It was distrust. On the way back, she took a deep breath. "Will it always be like this?" she asked. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Willow Creek doesn't forget easily," he said, "and it doesn't forgive quickly either." Grace nodded, trying to hide her discomfort. She had been judged before. She had carried that weight in other places, in other times. Still, it hurt. In the days that followed, Grace's presence spread through town like a poorly told story. Each person added a detail, a suspicion, a different version. To some, she was an opportunist. To others, a runaway. There were those who believed she married Ethan for money. Others said the marriage wouldn't last a winter. Grace felt it all, even without hearing the words. One afternoon, she decided to go to the post office alone. She needed to prove to herself that she wouldn't hide. She dressed simply and walked there, her heart racing. Inside the small building, two women were chatting near the counter. The moment Grace stepped in, the conversation stopped. One of them forced a smile. "You must be the new Mrs. Walker," she said, barely hiding her curiosity. "I am," Grace replied. "Nice to meet you." "And where are you from?" the woman pressed. Grace hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she didn't want to explain herself. "Far away," she said simply. The woman's smile faltered. "I see." Grace left the post office with trembling hands. She didn't cry. Not there. She walked back to the farm, each step heavier than the last. When Ethan found her sitting on the porch that evening, he immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. Grace took a long moment before answering. "I don't belong here," she finally said. "At least not to them." Ethan sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Willow Creek has never been kind to outsiders," he said. "Not even to me sometimes." "But you were born here," Grace replied. "I wasn't." He looked at her closely. "That doesn't make you less." "It makes me invisible," she said. "Or worse, a target." Ethan stayed silent. He knew she was right. In the days that followed, the tension grew. A worker made a sharp comment. A neighbor stopped greeting them. Grace's name began to circulate, always followed by speculation. Ethan tried to protect her in his own way, but there were limits. He couldn't control an entire town. One morning, Grace overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. She was near the barn when two workers spoke in low voices. "They say that marriage isn't real," one said. "Nothing about it feels real," the other replied. "Woman shows up out of nowhere. Something's wrong." Grace stepped away before they could see her. Her heart pounded, not because of the lie itself, but because of the danger it carried. When the truth came out, it wouldn't hurt just her and Ethan. The whole town would feel deceived. That day, Grace avoided town. She kept herself busy, but the unease wouldn't fade. She felt watched, even inside her own home. That night, she sat at the table with Ethan, her plate barely touched. "If this gets worse," she began. "It won't," Ethan interrupted. "It will," Grace said firmly, "because small towns survive on stories, and right now, we're the biggest one." Ethan took a deep breath. "I should have thought about this sooner," he admitted. Grace looked at him. "Thought about what?" He didn't answer. The lie sat between them like a third presence at the table. A few days later, the town organized a simple gathering in the central square. Nothing official, just a community event. Ethan hesitated about going. Grace insisted. "If we hide, they win," she said. They went together. The impact was immediate. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned. Grace held onto Ethan's arm tightly, but kept her smile. An older woman approached them. "So you're Ethan's wife?" she asked, her gaze sharp. "I am," Grace replied. "I hope you know what you're getting into," the woman said bluntly. Grace swallowed hard. "I do," she answered, "and I'm staying." A strange silence spread around them. Some people looked away. Others seemed surprised by her firmness. Ethan watched it all in silence. For the first time, he realized how much stronger Grace was than he had imagined. That night, on the drive home, the atmosphere was heavy. "You didn't have to face that alone," Ethan said. "I had to," Grace replied, "because if I don't stand for myself, no one will." He nodded. "Willow Creek will test you," he said. "It will push you as far as it can. Then it will get tired," she replied, "because I'm not leaving." Ethan looked at her with something new in his eyes. It wasn't just respect, it was admiration. Still, the danger remained. The town was watching, waiting, judging, and someday it would demand answers. Grace knew that. Ethan did too, and both understood that love, if it ever came, would have to be born under that weight. Under the watchful eyes of a town that never forgave lies and never forgot the truth. Grace never talked about the past, not because she had forgotten it, but because remembering meant crossing places that still hurt too much, places she had learned to lock carefully, like old doors closed tight to keep the cold out. But Willow Creek had a cruel way of breaking locks. That night, the wind blew hard around the house, the wood creaked, and the silence felt heavier than usual. Ethan was already asleep when Grace got out of bed, unable to close her eyes. Barefoot, she walked into the kitchen, turned on only the light above the sink, and rested her hands on the counter. Her reflection in the window glass looked like another woman. Older, more tired. It was there, in that silence, that the past began to seep in. Grace hadn't come from a stable family. She grew up in towns too small for big dreams. Her mother was a worn-down woman, marked by bad choices and broken promises. Her father, she barely remembered him. Only slamming doors and an old suitcase always leaning behind the couch. At 15, she learned far too early that love doesn't always protect. The man who entered her life back then said he would save her. He spoke beautifully, promised care, a future, belonging. Grace believed him because she wanted to believe, because no one had taught her to doubt sweet words spoken with conviction. The mistake was costly. By the time she realized it, she was trapped in a relationship that shrank her day by day, There were no visible bruises, but there was control, enforced silence, constant guilt. She stopped studying, stopped dreaming, stopped existing outside that shadow. She left home at 19 with a backpack and too much shame to ask for help. For years, Grace survived. Temporary jobs, rented rooms, nights when her crying was muffled against the pillow so as not to disturb strangers. She learned to smile less, to speak even less. That was when she got pregnant. The man wanted nothing to do with it, said it wasn't his problem, said she was on her own. Grace lost the baby in the 3rd month. She never told anyone. The pain was silent, deep, permanent. Something inside her closed that day, something that never returned to its place. After that, she learned to run, from cities, from people, from attachments. Whenever someone got too close, Grace left. Whenever she began to feel safe, she packed up and disappeared, until she met Ethan. He promised nothing, made no speeches, didn't try to save her. He simply offered a cold, practical agreement. A marriage that didn't require love, and for the first time, that felt safe. Grace exhaled, resting her forehead against the cold window glass. The farm slept around her, dark fields stretched as far as she could see. She thought about how solid that land was, constant, grounded, everything she had never been. Grace! Ethan's voice came low, surprised. She turned slowly. He stood in the kitchen doorway, hair messy from sleep, confusion on his face. "Sorry," she said. "I woke up." He stepped closer. "Are you okay?" Grace hesitated. That simple question opened a dangerous crack. "I don't know," she answered. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat at the table. "Do you want to talk?" She almost laughed, not from humor but disbelief. How many times had someone truly wanted to listen? "If I start," she said, "I don't know if I can stop." "Then don't stop," he replied. Grace sat across from him. Her hands trembled slightly. "I'm not who you think I am," she began. "And the town, they sense that." Ethan remained silent, attentive. "I didn't come from anywhere beautiful," she continued. "I don't have a story that inspires trust. I have mistakes, escapes, loose ends." She took a deep breath. "I once loved someone who destroyed me," she confessed. "And after that, I learned not to love anyone else. I learned how to survive." Ethan swallowed hard. "So why did you accept this marriage?" he asked. Grace lifted her eyes. "Because it was safe. Because it didn't demand love. Because I thought that if no one expected anything from me, I could finally rest." Silence stretched between them. "Willow Creek will find out," she said. "They always do. And when they do, they won't forgive me." Ethan watched her closely. There was no judgment in his eyes, only something deeper. Understanding. "They don't know you," he said. "They only know invented versions." Grace shook her head. "I don't even know myself anymore." In the days that followed, Grace closed herself off even more. She avoided long conversations, kept emotional distance. The past, once awakened, wouldn't leave her alone. She dreamed of narrow hallways, open suitcases, goodbyes without embraces. She woke up sweating, her heart racing. Ethan noticed. He tried to get closer through small gestures. Coffee left on the table, a folded blanket on the couch. Respectful silence. It was the kind of care that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, Grace went to the old barn. She needed to be alone. She sat on a bale of hay and let the tears fall without fighting them. There, far from the town's eyes, she allowed herself to feel everything she had avoided for years. The loss, the guilt, the constant fear of being abandoned again. "I'm not weak," she whispered to herself. "I survived." When she returned home, she found Ethan sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Willow Creek won't make it easy," he said without turning around, "but you're not alone here." Grace stopped behind him. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "Maybe not," he said, "mate, but I chose this. I chose you." Those words struck Grace in an unexpected way. She didn't answer. She didn't know how. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling for a long time. For the first time in years, she thought that maybe running wasn't the only option, that maybe facing things hurt less than constantly escaping. But the past doesn't surrender easily. And Willow Creek was still watching, waiting for the right moment to turn badly, told stories into cruel truths. Grace knew it. The worst was still to come. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to run when it did. Willow Creek didn't attack all at once. It eroded. Grace realized this on an apparently ordinary morning when she left the house to buy bread at the market and felt, before she even saw it, that something had changed. The air felt thicker, her steps heavier, the windows more watchful. She crossed the main street with her head held high, but her heart restless. No one greeted her. No one smiled. It was as if her presence had become a collective inconvenience. At the market, the clerk didn't respond to her good morning. Grace placed the bread on the counter, waited. The silence stretched. "Will you be taking anything else?" the woman asked without looking up. "No," Grace replied. "Just this." The money was pushed back toward her. "Not today." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman finally looked at her. There was no anger in her eyes, only coldness. "I think it would be best if you settled your affairs before continuing to shop here." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I don't understand." "You do," the woman replied quietly. "Everyone here does." Grace left the market with empty hands, her breathing shallow. Outside, two women were talking near the window. They stopped when she passed. "That's her," one of them said without hiding it. Grace quickened her pace. At the post office, the door was closed. A simple handwritten note read, "Back later. It was far too early for that." At the pharmacy, the same heavy silence, the same evaluating look. When she returned home, she felt smaller, as if the entire town had decided to tighten the circle all at once. Ethan noticed immediately. "What happened?" he asked as soon as he saw her walk in. Grace dropped her bag on the table harder than she intended. "What happened is that Willow Creek has decided it doesn't like me anymore," she said. He stepped closer. "What did they do?" She took a deep breath. "They pushed me out slowly. No shouting, no accusations, just closing doors." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That's not right." "For them it is," Grace said, "because they believe they know something I don't." Ethan felt the weight of those words. He knew exactly what she meant. In the days that followed, the situation worsened. A supplier cancelled a delivery. A neighbor stopped returning greetings. One of the workers quit without explanation. Grace began to feel afraid. Not the immediate violent kind of fear, but the quiet fear that settles in your stomach and never leaves. The fear of being isolated, of being pushed out without anyone ever touching you. One afternoon, Ethan was summoned to town hall. Nothing official, just a conversation. Grace insisted on going with him. The room was simple, with old chairs and the faint smell of aged wood. Some residents were already there, all familiar faces, all watching too closely. "This isn't a trial," said the man who seemed to lead the meeting. "It's just a concern from the community." Grace sat beside Ethan, her hands tightly intertwined. "A concern about what?" Ethan asked. The man cleared his throat. "About the story of this marriage," he replied. "It happened too fast, changed too much." "That's none of your business," Grace said before Ethan could speak. Murmurs spread. "It is our business when it affects the town," said an older woman. "Willow Creek values certain principles." Grace felt her face burn. "And which principles have I violated?" she asked. Silence was the answer. "We don't know where you came from," the woman continued. "We don't know who you are, and yet you became the wife of one of the most respected men here." Grace felt the accusation like a blade. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling inside. "I didn't deceive anyone." Ethan stood up. "This ends now," he said. "You have no right to interrogate my wife." "We have the right to protect our town," the leader replied. Grace stood as well. "You're not protecting anything," she said. "You're just attacking what you don't understand." A man at the back of the room spoke. "Then tell us your story." Grace's heart nearly stopped. "No," she said. "I don't owe that to you." "You do," he insisted, "because secrets here always come out." Ethan felt Grace's silent panic beside him. "That's enough," he said. "This conversation is over." They left under hard stares, unspoken words, and judgments hanging thick in the air. On the drive back, Grace said nothing. The silence inside the car was unbearable. "They're going to keep going," she said finally, "until they break me or force me out." Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I won't let that happen." "You can't control an entire town," she replied. He didn't answer. That night, Grace struggled to breathe. She felt cornered. The farm, once a refuge, now felt like a fragile border between her and the world. She sat on the porch, hugging her knees. "Maybe I should leave," she said when Ethan sat beside her. He looked at her. "Don't say that. I brought this to you," she continued. "To your house, to your life." "You brought nothing," he replied. "The town did this. But they wouldn't have attacked if I weren't here." Ethan was silent for a few seconds. "Maybe," he said, "but if you leave now, they win." Tears slipped down Grace's face. "I'm tired of being strong." Ethan placed his hand over hers. "Then don't be," he said. "Be honest, be human. I'll carry the rest." She looked at him. For the first time, she saw something different there. Not obligation, not agreement, choice. But the town wouldn't back down easily. In the days that followed, the stories grew harsher. A rumor gained strength. They said Grace was hiding something serious, something shameful, something unforgivable, and Willow Creek fed on it. Grace felt the town's gaze, even when she was alone. She felt watched, measured, condemned, without a formal judgment. That morning, when she opened the door, she found a note attached to the farm fence. "Leave before it's too late." Her hands trembled. When Ethan read it, he closed his eyes for a moment. "This has crossed the line," he said. Grace felt real fear, not just of Willow Creek, but of what might happen when the truth, hers and his, finally came to light. The town was attacking, and the next blow could be irreversible. Ethan had always believed that some truths were too heavy to be spoken aloud, not because they were cruel, but because they changed everything around them, people, places, memories. Once certain words are spoken, there is no way back to the comfortable silence that came before. He learned that early, long before Grace crossed the path of the farm, long before the marriage that began as an agreement and slowly became something too dangerous to be called convenience. That night, after the note was found tied to the fence, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to Grace's soft breathing beside him. She looked exhausted, like someone who had spent days fighting something invisible. And he knew part of that exhaustion was his fault. He got up quietly, pulled on his shirt, and stepped out onto the porch. The early morning air was cold, the sky was too clear, stars scattered like silent witnesses. The farm looked calm, but it was a false calm, the kind that comes before a storm. Ethan leaned against the railing and closed his eyes. The secret was not new. He had carried it for years. Willow Creek believed it knew Ethan Walker, the reserved, hard-working man, widowed by solitude, heir to old land and firm values. A respected man, but that was only the surface. The truth began long before the farm prospered, before he became the man everyone saw. Ethan had grown up on that very land, under the shadow of a hard, silent father, a man who believed emotions were weakness, that mistakes did not deserve forgiveness. When Ethan was 22, he made the mistake that changed everything. He fell in love. Her name was Claire. Claire wasn't from Willow Creek. She arrived the same way Grace did, an outsider carrying few suitcases and many silences. She worked at the old corner cafe. She had an easy smile and a sadness hidden in her eyes. They grew close too quickly and lost themselves just as quickly. When Claire became pregnant, fear consumed them both. Ethan wasn't ready. He didn't know how to face his father, the town, the expectations. He said he needed time. He asked for secrecy. Claire waited, but time never came. The town found out before Ethan found the courage to speak. Willow Creek was not kind. The accusations, the whispers, the stares, everything fell on Claire like a public sentence. Ethan tried to protect her too late. When he finally decided to take responsibility, she was already broken. Claire left on a cold dawn, pregnant and alone. Ethan never saw her again. Years later, he heard rumors. They said she had lost the baby. They said she moved on in another city. Nothing confirmed, nothing certain. The guilt rooted itself in him like a silent disease. From then on, Ethan lived to compensate. He worked too much, avoided attachments, turned the farm into a shield, built respect to hide the failure no one else remembered, but he never forgot, until Grace arrived. Grace awakened something he believed buried, the chance to do things differently, but the past never stays buried forever. The note on the fence proved that. "Ethan?" Grace's voice pulled him back. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her coat, her face tired. "You didn't come back to bed," she said. "I needed to think." She stepped closer, standing beside him. She didn't touch him. She simply stayed. "Is it about the note?" she asked. "It's about everything," he replied. Grace watched him in silence. She felt something larger moving beneath the surface, something old. "You're hiding something from me," she said carefully. Ethan took a deep breath. "Yes." The word fell heavy between them. Grace's heart began to race. "What?" He took his time answering, not from doubt, but because he knew that once spoken, nothing would be the same. "Willow Creek isn't attacking you just out of fear of the unknown," he began. "They're afraid of the past resurfacing." Grace frowned. "Your past?" He nodded slowly. "I already destroyed someone here," he said. "And the town never forgot. It only waited." A chill ran through Grace. "Ethan, before you arrived," he continued, "I believed living alone was the price I deserved, that I didn't deserve more. When you accepted this marriage, I thought maybe it was a second chance." He looked at her. "But I pulled you into something that's still bleeding." Grace felt her throat tighten. "You have to tell me," she said. "Everything." Ethan looked out at the dark fields. Then he began. He told her about Claire, about rushed love, fear, cowardice. He spoke of the pregnancy, the town, the silent departure. He spoke of the guilt that never left. Grace listened without interrupting. Every word fit into something she had felt from the beginning. When he finished, the silence was almost deafening. "So," Grace finally said, "you know exactly what they're doing to me." Ethan closed his eyes. "I do. Because they did it to her." He nodded. Grace took a deep breath, feeling pain mixed with understanding. "And you never told me," she said. "Because I was afraid," he replied, "afraid of losing you, afraid of repeating everything." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm not angry." He looked at her, surprised. "You're not?" "I'm afraid," she said, "because now I understand. Willow Creek isn't testing me. It's waiting for you to fail again." The weight of that truth hit him hard. "I won't fail," he said. Grace stepped closer. "Then you need to choose," she said. "Either you face this town once and for all, or you'll lose me the same way you lost her." The words hung in the air. Ethan knew the time for silence was over. The secret had stepped out of the shadows, and Willow Creek was closer than ever to turning the past into a final sentence. Willow Creek didn't need proof. A well-placed whisper was enough. The morning after the conversation on the porch, Ethan woke with the uneasy feeling that something had already begun. There was no unusual noise, no strange movement on the farm. Still, the air felt heavier, as if the land itself knew an old truth had been awakened. Grace was in the kitchen when he came in, stirring her coffee without really looking at the cup. "They know," she said, without lifting her eyes. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Know what?" he asked. "Because Willow Creek always knows," she replied, "even before we do." She told him that earlier that morning a woman from town had stopped her car near the fence, said nothing, just watched the house for a few seconds, then drove away. It wasn't a direct threat, it was a warning. "That's how it starts," Grace said. "First the look, then the judgment." Ethan knew she was right. In town, the past had a name, and that name began circulating again. Claire. The sound of it, after so many years, echoed through the invisible corridors of Willow Creek. Someone mentioned it at the market. Another confirmed it at the cafe. A third added details that weren't even true. The story rebuilt itself in twisted ways, as it always does when guilt meets collective memory. "He did this before," they said. "Woman from outside. Unclear story. The town suffered once because of this." Grace felt the weight of it when she tried to leave the house again. On the road toward town, she noticed cars slowing as they passed the farm. People watching with exaggerated attention, some curious, others openly disapproving. At the market, no one spoke to her. It was no longer silence. It was open exclusion. Grace placed her items on the counter. The same clerk from before took a deep breath. "Maybe it would be best if you left while there's still time," she said quietly. Grace looked at her. "Leave why?" The woman hesitated. "Because this town has been through this once before," she replied. "And it didn't end well." "For whom?" Grace asked. The clerk didn't answer. Outside, two men spoke openly. "Ethan Walker never learned," one said. "And now he brought another one to suffer," the other added. Grace passed them without lowering her head, but something broke inside her. When she returned to the farm, she found Ethan in the barn, speaking to one of the oldest workers. The man walked away quickly when he saw her. "He quit," Ethan said. "Said he doesn't want to get involved." Grace nodded slowly. "They're organizing," she said. "Like before." Ethan clenched his jaw. "This time will be different." But even he didn't sound fully convinced. That afternoon, the inevitable happened. A group of townspeople appeared near the entrance of the farm. It wasn't a crowd, it was worse. Familiar faces. People Ethan had greeted since childhood, people who had grown up around that land. "We need to talk," said the man leading the group. Ethan walked out to meet them. Grace followed close behind. "There's nothing left to say," Ethan said. "You've already said enough." "No," the man replied. "Now it's different. Now we know." Grace felt her heart race. "Know what?" she asked. An older woman stepped forward. "We know who you resemble," she said. "We know how this ends." Grace swallowed hard. "I'm not that woman," she replied. "It doesn't matter," the woman said. "The story is the same." Ethan stepped in front of Grace. "Don't you dare," he said. "Don't repeat what you did to Claire." The name fell like a stone. A murmur spread instantly. "So you admit it," someone said. Ethan took a deep breath. "I admit I was wrong," he said. "I admit I was a coward. But I won't let you use that to destroy another person." "You already are," the man replied. "This town doesn't accept lies." Something shifted inside Grace. She stepped forward. "Then listen to the truth," she said. The group fell silent. "I didn't come here to deceive anyone," she continued. "I came because I had nowhere else to go. I came because this marriage didn't promise me love, only safety. And that was all I needed at the time." Some exchanged glances. "If that's a crime," Grace said, "then judge me, but don't compare me to someone you already hurt once." The silence stretched. The older woman pressed her lips together. "Willow Creek doesn't trust those who run from the past," she said. Grace took a deep breath. "I'm not running," she replied. "I'm surviving." The group began to disperse, not in peace but in caution. When they were gone, Grace felt her legs weaken. Ethan caught her just in time. "I knew this would happen," she said, her voice trembling, "and I stayed anyway." Ethan held her tightly, as if trying to protect her from the entire world. "I won't let you pay for what I did," he said. "Maybe it's already too late," she replied. That night, the town talked. In bars, in kitchens, in living rooms. It talked until it was exhausted. Some defended Ethan, saying he had changed. Others said it was too late for redemption. Grace became a symbol. For some, a victim. For others, a repetition of the mistake. And Willow Creek waited, because small towns don't forget quickly. They wait for the exact moment to decide who stays and who must leave. Grace spent the night awake, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she was afraid to close her eyes. Every time she tried, she saw the same scene: an empty road, a suitcase on the back seat, and the heavy silence of someone leaving without knowing if they would ever return. That was how it always ended. She sat on the edge of the bed before dawn, her feet touching the cold floor. Ethan slept beside her, his face tired, the marks of worry still visible even in sleep. Grace watched him for a few seconds, feeling the tightness in her chest grow. He didn't deserve this. Neither of them did. She got up quietly, put on a coat, and left the room. The house was silent. The clock read a little past 5 in the morning. The farm was still asleep, wrapped in a light fog that covered the fields like a veil. Grace walked to the kitchen and put water on to boil. She wasn't hungry, but she needed to keep her hands busy. She needed to think. The decision growing inside her wasn't new. It had just become impossible to ignore. Willow Creek was not going to stop. The town didn't want answers. It wanted an ending, and for them, the simplest ending was always the same. Someone had to leave. Grace rested her hands on the sink and took a deep breath. She had left so many times before. Always before the pain became too much. Always before attachment grew roots. Running away was the only thing she had ever learned to do well. But this time, it hurt differently, because this time someone would be left behind. She thought of Ethan, of the quiet way he took care of things, of how he respected her without demanding anything. She thought of the farm, which little by little had stopped being just a temporary place and had started to feel like home. She thought, with a knot in her throat, that maybe love was beginning there. And that terrified her. Love always demanded too high a price. When the sun began to rise on the horizon, Grace made her decision. She didn't say it out loud. She simply felt it. She would leave, not out of cowardice, but out of protection. Because if she stayed, The town would eventually destroy Ethan the way it had tried before, because she couldn't bear to be the reason for his downfall. She went back upstairs and took the small suitcase she still kept at the back of the closet. She had never fully unpacked it. Part of her had always known she might need it. She packed only a few clothes, the essentials, just like she always did. She stopped in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked stronger than the one who had arrived at the farm weeks earlier, but she also looked more tired. "This isn't running," she whispered to herself. "It's choosing." She went downstairs silently and left the suitcase near the back door. Then she sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pen. She took a long time to write. Words were never enough when it came to goodbyes. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and left it beside the cup of coffee she had prepared for Ethan. The sound of wood upstairs told her he was waking up. Grace felt her heart race. Maybe there was still time to change her mind. Maybe she could stay one more day, one more night, but she knew if she faced him now, she wouldn't leave. She grabbed the suitcase, opened the door, and stepped into the cold morning air. That was when she heard his voice. "Grace?" She stopped. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face confused, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "What are you doing?" he asked. Grace took a deep breath before turning around. "I'm leaving." The word fell between them like something irreversible. "What?" he said, stepping forward. "No, not like this." "It has to be this way," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan looked at the suitcase, then at her face. "Because of the town?" he asked. Grace nodded. "They won't stop," she said. "And you know it." "Then we face them together," he replied. Grace felt tears threaten to fall. "You faced this before," she said, "and you lost someone because of it." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "I won't lose you," he said. "You will," she replied, her voice breaking. "If I stay." She stepped closer to him. "I can't be the reason they destroy you again." "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You never were." "Maybe not to you," she replied, "but to this town I am." Ethan grabbed her arm. "Don't go." Grace felt his touch like a desperate plea. "If I stay," she said, "you'll end up having to choose between me and Willow Creek, and I don't want to be that choice." "I've already chosen," he replied. Grace shook her head. "You think you have," she said, "but you don't know the price yet." A long silence settled between them. The sun was already lighting the fields, turning the fog gold. "I left a note," she said, pointing toward the kitchen, "not because I don't have the courage to speak, but because I needed to leave before I changed my mind." Ethan ran a hand over his face, breathing deeply. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she replied, "like always." He looked at her with pain in his eyes. "Do you always leave when things get hard?" Grace felt the weight of the question. "No," she replied, "only when staying means hurting the person I love." The words hung in the air. Ethan's heart tightened. "So that's it," he said softly. "You love me?" Grace didn't answer right away. The silence was the most honest answer she could give. "I'm learning to," she said finally, "and that's already more than I ever planned to feel again." She gently pulled away and walked toward the old car she had been using since arriving at the farm. She placed the suitcase in the trunk, sat in the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. Ethan stood still, watching. When the engine started, something inside Grace broke. She drove away from the farm without looking back. In the rearview mirror, she saw Ethan growing smaller, motionless, alone in front of the house. The road stretched ahead of her, long and silent. Grace felt her chest tighten like never before. Leaving had always been easy, but for the first time, leaving felt more painful than staying. And as Willow Creek woke up to another day, one question lingered in the air. Was Grace running away? Or saving the only place that, against all expectations, had begun to feel like home? The house was far too silent to be just an ordinary morning. Ethan sensed it before he even opened his eyes. There were no soft footsteps in the hallway, no almost imperceptible sound of the kettle being placed on the stove. The silence had weight, it had shape, it had a name. Grace. He remained lying there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, as if his body still hoped this was only a delay in time. But when he turned and found the other side of the bed empty, reality struck without mercy. She was gone. He got up slowly, his body heavy as if he had aged years in a single night. He walked to the kitchen with dragging steps and found exactly what he feared. The cold cup of coffee, the folded note, the loud absence of any sign of return. Ethan sat at the table before reading. He knew that after those words, something inside him would finally break. Grace had written little, but she had written everything. She spoke of protection, of choice, of not repeating stories that had already hurt too many people. There were no accusations, no promises, only a goodbye that hurt precisely because it was honest. He clenched the paper in his fingers. For years, he had believed that silence was a form of penance, that living withdrawn, distant, fulfilling obligations, and avoiding attachments was a fair payment for the mistake of the past. It never was. Silence hadn't redeemed him. It had only made him complicit in his own cowardice. And now, another woman had left because of it. Ethan stood up with a determination he had never felt before. There was no more room for waiting, for caution, for silence. Willow Creek would hear him. He put on his coat, grabbed his keys, and left the house. As he closed the door, he noticed something strange. For the first time in years, he didn't feel fear about what he was about to face. He felt shame for not having done it sooner. The town was beginning to wake when he arrived. Parked trucks, shops opening, morning conversations happening as if nothing had changed. But Ethan knew everything had changed. He parked near the square and stepped out. Some people recognized him immediately. Others simply sensed that something was off. He didn't go straight to the cafe. He first walked down the main street, past the pharmacy, the post office, the market. In each window, he saw reflections of the man he had become, closed off, respected, distant. A man who never explained anything until today. The cafe was crowded, farm workers, retirees, long-time residents, the kind of crowd that turned rumors into permanent truths. When Ethan entered, the murmur gradually faded. The owner looked up and frowned. "Ethan," he began. "I need to speak," Ethan interrupted. "To everyone." The man hesitated but didn't stop him. Ethan walked to the center of the room. He felt dozens of eyes on him, some hard, some curious, some already ready to judge. "I stayed silent for years," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. "I thought silence was enough. That time would erase what happened here." He took a deep breath. It didn't. A woman crossed her arms. "So you came to clean your image now that the other one left?" she asked. The word "other" cut deeply. "She was not the other," Ethan replied. "And she didn't leave out of cowardice. She left because she believed she was protecting someone." A murmur spread through the room. "Years ago," he continued, "I did exactly what you're doing now. I judged in silence. I waited for the problem to disappear. And I let a woman face this town alone." The name surfaced like a collective whisper. "Claire." Ethan nodded. "I failed her," he said. "And I spent my whole life pretending that paying in solitude was enough." An older man stood up. "So you're saying Willow Creek was wrong?" Ethan looked straight at him. "I'm saying I was wrong first," he replied, "but the town repeated the mistake." The air grew heavy. "Grace didn't deceive anyone," Ethan continued. "She didn't come for money. She didn't come to take anything. She came because she needed a safe place, and what she received was exclusion, threats, and fear. "This town protects its values," the older woman said. "Values that drive innocent people away are not values," Ethan replied. "They are fear disguised as morality." Silence spread like a physical weight. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm taking responsibility. And I'm saying I won't allow you to destroy another person just to preserve a comfortable story." He paused. "Grace left because she believed I would still choose silence. Because she thought I wouldn't have the courage to face you." He looked around. "But I'm here." Some people looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably. "Think carefully," Ethan said, "because if she ever comes back, it won't be to prove she deserves to stay. It will be to see whether this town has learned anything." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Claire never had that chance," he said. "Grace still might." He left the cafe under a heavy silence. Outside, the town felt different, not less hostile, but unsettled. People whispered. Others watched quietly. For the first time, there was no absolute certainty in their faces. Ethan walked to the square and sat for a few minutes. The wind blew softly. He thought of Claire. He thought of Grace. He thought of how many wrong decisions could fit inside one man. When he returned to the farm, the place still felt painfully empty. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like preparation. Ethan entered the house, took the note from his pocket, and placed it carefully on the table. "I spoke," he said to the emptiness. "Now I wait." The road still separated them, but the silence that had kept them apart for so long had finally been broken. The road seemed endless. Grace had been driving for hours, but the dashboard no longer meant anything. Miles stopped being numbers and became emotional distance. Each white line on the asphalt felt like a mark of something left behind. Willow Creek, the farm, the house, Ethan. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, but her mind kept looking back. The radio was off. No music, no voices. The silence was heavy, almost deafening, yet still better than the questions echoing inside her. The engine hummed low and steady, as if the car were the only thing that knew exactly what it was doing. Grace tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Her hands were shaking. It wasn't fear of the road. It was fear of herself. The sky began to change colors. Shades of orange and gold appeared on the horizon, reminding her of afternoons on the farm, when the sun slowly disappeared behind the fields, and Ethan would always stand there watching, as if searching the sky for answers. She swallowed hard. "I tried," she whispered to the empty windshield. She tried to understand Ethan's silences. She tried to respect his time. She tried to love without pressure, without demands, without expectations. But there are moments when silence stops being protection and becomes abandonment. She remembered the first night after the wedding, the way he sat on the edge of the bed, distant, almost absent. The look in his eyes heavy with something he couldn't say. Grace remembered waiting, in silence. As always, maybe she had waited too long. Tears began to rise, blurring her vision. She blinked quickly, took a deep breath and slowed down. She didn't want to cry while driving, but she couldn't stop it. It was strange how the pain didn't come in explosions. It came in silent waves, deep, constant. A mature pain, a tired one. Grace pulled over to the side of the road. She turned off the engine. The world seemed to stop with it. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes. The tears finally fell, warm and slow, as if they had been waiting for permission. There were no sobs, just the quiet cry of someone who had already cried too much on the inside. She stepped out of the car. The cold wind touched her face, drying the tears. The smell of earth, grass, and wet pavement brought memories she didn't want, but couldn't avoid. She remembered arriving at the farm for the first time, with a small suitcase and a heart full of uncertainty. She remembered Ethan's look that day, guarded, restrained, but kind. She walked a few steps along the roadside. "Maybe I was weak," she whispered. "Or maybe I just got tired of being strong alone." The sky seemed to listen, but it did not answer. Grace returned to the car and continued driving. Hours later, the landscape began to change. Fields gave way to small towns, houses closer together, streetlights, signs, people who didn't know her and knew nothing about her story. She stopped at an old gas station, the kind that feels frozen in time. She bought coffee but couldn't taste it. She sat near the window, watching cars arrive and leave. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, a destination, a reason. She had only an escape. Almost without realizing it, she picked up her phone, opened the gallery. The photo appeared immediately, as if it had been waiting for her. Grace and Ethan on the porch, the sun setting behind them. It wasn't loud happiness. It was contained, delicate, real. She ran her finger across the screen. "Why did you never say anything?" she murmured. She locked the phone and stood up quickly, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. Back on the road, the exhaustion began to weigh on her. Not just physical, emotional. Every mile demanded more from her. More decisions, more courage. As the sun dropped low, Grace spotted a small roadside motel. Simple lights, no promises beyond a bed and silence. It was all she needed. The room was simple, clean, cold, impersonal, exactly how she felt. She sat on the bed and let her bag fall to the floor. For the first time since she left, she didn't try to be strong. She cried. She cried for the woman she was before Willow Creek. She cried for the woman she tried to become after. She cried for the love that didn't die, but also couldn't live. She thought of Ethan, imagined him walking through the empty house, sitting alone at the table, facing the same silence he always carried, now amplified by her absence. Grace didn't know that at that very moment, Ethan was facing his own ghosts. She picked up the phone again, typed his name. The cursor blinked, waiting for a decision. A word, a bridge. She erased it. "If I go back now," she whispered, "nothing changes." She lay down, staring at the ceiling. The shadows formed strange shapes, like memories refusing to disappear. She thought of Claire. She thought of Ethan's fear of losing again. She thought of her own fear of losing herself while trying to save him. That night, she slept poorly. She dreamed of the road. She dreamed of the farm. She dreamed of Ethan calling her name, but without sound. She woke up several times, her heart racing, as if something was about to happen. When morning came, Grace slowly opened the curtain. Light flooded the room, soft and promising. The sky was clear, blue, too beautiful for someone who felt so confused. She sat on the bed and took a deep breath. She wasn't ready to go back yet, but she wasn't ready to leave forever either. She picked up her bag, looked at the car keys, then at her phone. The road was still there, and somewhere between fear and love, Grace felt that a greater decision was still waiting for her. Maybe the silence had spoken too loudly. Maybe someone was finally learning how to break it. And maybe it wasn't too late. The house was far too quiet. Ethan noticed it the moment he walked through the front door and didn't hear the soft sound of Grace's footsteps, nor the faint noise of the kettle on the stove, nor the almost imperceptible breathing of someone who tried not to take up space. Now, the silence was absolute. He dropped his hat onto the table and stood still in the middle of the room, as if his body still expected her to appear from somewhere. The emptiness felt larger than the house itself. Every piece of furniture, every wall, every sliver of light exposed her absence. Grace was gone, and for the first time since losing her, Ethan couldn't pretend that everything was fine. He walked slowly into the kitchen. Her mug was still on the counter. A small stain of dried coffee rested at the bottom, a trivial detail, meaningless to anyone else. But to him, it was proof that she had been there, that it hadn't been a dream. He held the mug with excessive care, as if it might shatter under the weight of his own hands. "I did it again," he murmured, his voice rough. He climbed the stairs with heavy steps. Each one creaked, echoing like an accusation. In the bedroom, her side of the bed was too neat. No clothes scattered, no suitcase, just an empty space that looked hurriedly cleaned, as if Grace had been afraid to leave traces behind. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, right there, where so many nights he had stayed silent, pretending to sleep while the past screamed inside him. He closed his eyes, and without asking permission, the past returned. Claire. The name surfaced like an open wound. Claire had been his wife, his first love, the woman who believed in him when he was nothing more than a man trying to survive his own pain. They had built that farm together. Every fence, every tree, every piece of land carried their story. Ethan remembered her laughter, the way she spoke to the animals, the way she held his hand when fear took hold of him, until the day everything collapsed. The accident was fast, unfair, one of those moments that doesn't even give you time to breathe. A phone call, silence on the other end of the line, a world split in two. Since then, Ethan had learned to survive by shutting down. Not feeling was safer. Not loving was a form of protection. Silence was his shield. When Grace entered his life, he swore to himself he would never let her cross those walls. The marriage was an agreement, a necessity, nothing more. But he failed, because Grace didn't try to invade. She simply stayed, and little by little, that undid everything. Ethan ran a hand over his face, feeling the unshaven beard, the accumulated exhaustion, the weight of wrong choices. He stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the field stretched as far as the eye could see. They had always been there, steady, constant, unlike him. "I pushed you away," he said out loud, "because I was afraid of losing you." The absurdity of that sentence hit him like a punch. He was afraid of losing Grace, and because of that, he lost her. He went back downstairs and left the house without grabbing his coat. The cold wind cut across his face, but he didn't care. He walked toward the barn, the place where he always hid when his thoughts grew too loud. He leaned against one of the wooden beams and let his body slide down to the ground. There, alone, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He cried. It wasn't pretty or quiet. It was raw, uncontrolled, the kind of cry that comes from holding on too long for too long. Tears streamed freely. His shoulders shook. His breathing broke. He cried for Claire. He cried for Grace. He cried for himself. "I don't know how to love without losing," he whispered. "But I'm tired of running." The words hung in the air, heavy, real. When he stood up, something inside him had changed. It wasn't full courage. It wasn't certainty. It was a decision. Ethan got into the car with a single thought pounding in his mind. He needed to do something he had never done before. He needed to speak. He drove into town without noticing the time pass. Willow Creek looked the same as always, but he felt as if he were crossing unfamiliar territory. He stopped in front of the church, where everything had begun. He got out of the car and stood there for a few minutes, staring at the closed doors. There, he had made a promise he never kept. He headed to the small cafe in town. A few looks turned toward him. Whispers started almost immediately. The town knew, it always did. "Ethan," the woman behind the counter called out, surprised. "Haven't seen you in a while?" "Yeah," he replied. "I needed to get away from the farm." She nodded, the way people do when they understand more than they ask. He sat at a table near the window and stared at the street. People walked by. Lives moved forward, and he had been standing in the same emotional place for years. He picked up his phone. Grace's name appeared on the screen. His finger hesitated, then pressed. Calling. No answer. His heart tightened, but he didn't give up. He left a message. His voice was unsteady but honest. Grace, it's me. I know you might not want to hear from me right now, but I need to say that I was wrong. I ran, I hid, and I lost you because of it. I'm not calling to ask you to come back. I'm calling to tell you that I finally understand. If you're still willing to listen, I will talk about everything. For the first time. He ended the call with trembling hands. He didn't know if she would listen. He didn't know if she would come back. But he knew one thing: he would no longer stay silent. As he left the cafe, the wind felt less cold, the sky less heavy. Not because everything was solved, but because for the first time, Ethan was walking toward the truth. He returned to the farm as evening fell. He entered the empty house and turned on the lights, something he never did when he was alone. He sat at the table and waited. He waited not for Grace, but for the chance to be someone different. That night, Ethan Walker finally stopped running, even without knowing if there was still someone waiting for him on the other side of the silence. Grace was sitting on the edge of the bed when she felt the phone vibrate. It wasn't loud, it wasn't insistent, it was brief, subtle, almost shy. Still, the sound crossed the room like thunder. She froze. The phone lay face down on the small wooden table. Grace knew she shouldn't look. She knew she had promised herself an entire day without thinking about Ethan. A full day to breathe without the weight of the farm, without his silence, without the pain of trying to love someone who kept hiding. But the heart didn't obey promises made by reason. She reached out slowly, as if the phone might disappear if she touched it too fast. She turned the screen over. A notification. A voice message. From Ethan. Grace felt her stomach twist. His name seemed larger than the other words on the screen, heavier, loaded with everything that was still unresolved. She let the phone fall back onto the table. "Not now," she murmured, almost pleading with herself. She stood up and began pacing the narrow motel room. The worn carpet muffled her steps, but not her thoughts. Every corner of that place felt too small for what she was carrying inside. The walls held no stories. They didn't know her past. They had no memory of her attempts to be strong, and yet the past was there. Grace leaned against the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. Deep shades of blue blended with the distant orange of the setting sun. It was beautiful, painfully beautiful, like the nights on the farm. She took a deep breath, tried to remember why she had left. She remembered the silent nights, the empty space between them in bed, the way Ethan looked away whenever she tried to get close. She remembered feeling invisible even while being present. "I did everything I could," she whispered. She looked back at the phone. The message was still there, waiting. Grace sat down on the bed again, this time holding the phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, uncertain. Part of her wanted to delete the message without listening. Another part, the one that still loved him, needed to know, needed to hear it. She pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the small room, unsteady, carrying something Grace had rarely heard from him before: vulnerability. She closed her eyes as she listened. Every word seemed to find an exact place inside her. There were no grand promises, no desperate pleas. It was regret, recognition, truth. When the message ended, silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was heavy with possibility. Grace remained seated, motionless, for long minutes. Her heart beat fast, uneven. Her hands were damp. A knot formed in her throat, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She opened her eyes and stared at the phone. "Now you speak," she murmured with a sad smile. "Right now." She lay on her side, hugging a pillow that smelled like nothing familiar. The ceiling felt lower, the room smaller. The distance between her and Willow Creek felt greater than the miles suggested. She thought of Ethan sitting at the farm table, waiting. She thought of the barn, the fields, the house lit up for the first time in a long while. She thought of the word he had used. I understand. Grace never thought she would hear that word from him. Memories of the beginning of their marriage came rushing back. The cold agreement, the way he kept everything under control, the invisible wall that kept her from fully reaching him. Is it different now? She whispered. She sat up again and opened the messaging app, typed his name. The cursor blinked insistently, as if urging her to decide something she wasn't sure she was ready to decide. She typed a sentence, deleted it, typed another, deleted it again. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt safe. Grace stood and walked into the bathroom. She washed her face, trying to erase the emotional exhaustion reflected in the mirror. Her eyes were red, her hair messy. She looked like someone in transition, someone between two worlds. You can't go back just because he spoke beautifully, she told herself. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that this was the first time Ethan hadn't hidden behind silence. She returned to the room and sat down again, picked up the phone with firmer hands this time. She listened to the message once more. Each word hurt less and meant more. Grace began to type. Ethan. She stopped, took a deep breath, deleted it. She locked the phone. Not today, she decided. Today I need to sleep without deciding anything. She turned off the light and lay down. The room went dark, but her mind stayed awake. Images blended together. The road, the farm, his eyes, the sound of his voice saying he wouldn't run anymore. Sleep took a long time to come. When it finally did, it brought restless dreams. Grace dreamed she was on the road, but the car wouldn't move. She dreamed she called for Ethan, and this time he answered. She dreamed she was going back, but woke up before arriving. At dawn, light slipped through the cracks in the curtain. Grace opened her eyes slowly. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then everything returned. The motel, the road, the message. She reached for the phone immediately. No new notifications. She sat on the bed, feeling something different in her chest. It wasn't full hope. It wasn't certainty. It was possibility. Grace knew she couldn't stay there forever. The road would demand a choice. Go back, move forward, or get lost trying not to decide. She stood up and began packing her bag. Ethan's message was still there, waiting, just like him. And for the first time since she left, Grace didn't dismiss the idea of replying. Silence had never been so loud. Grace realized it the moment she stepped out of the motel. The parking lot was nearly empty, the morning air still cold, and the sky far too clear for someone carrying so many doubts. She placed her bag on the passenger seat, sat behind the wheel, and stayed there, motionless, hands resting in place, feeling the weight of everything that still hadn't been said. The phone lay on the console, screen facing up. No notifications, no new messages, no replies. Ethan's silence was different now. It wasn't absence, it was waiting. Grace started the car, but didn't drive off right away. She stared at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something from the past catching up to her. The engine hummed softly, impatient, while she remained trapped inside herself. She thought about replying, thought about typing something simple. And I heard you. And I need time. And I don't know. But every sentence seemed to carry too many consequences. Miles away, Ethan was living the same silence. He had woken before dawn, without an alarm, as if his body knew there would be no real rest. The house was quiet again, but now he didn't fear it. He walked into the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table, staring at his phone as if it were something unfamiliar. No reply. Ethan didn't know if that meant no, or just not yet. He stood up and stepped outside. The sun was rising on the horizon, washing the fields in a soft, almost gentle light. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth. That farm had always been his refuge. Now it was his confrontation. "I spoke," he said to himself. "For the first time, I spoke." Still, the fear remained. Fear that he had spoken too late. Grace drove slowly, as if the world had slowed down along with her. Every road sign seemed to ask where she was going. Every curve reminded her that turning back was just as easy as moving forward. She stopped at a small lookout along the road, turned off the engine and stepped out. The wind tangled her hair, bringing a sense of freedom mixed with guilt. She leaned against the railing and looked out at the open landscape ahead. "Why is it so hard to answer?" she whispered. Because answering meant admitting she still felt something. Because answering meant opening a door she had closed to protect herself. Because answering meant risking being hurt again. She picked up the phone, opened Ethan's message once more, read it, then listened, then closed her eyes. There was no lie in his voice, no empty excuses. There was a broken man trying finally to be honest. Grace rested her forehead against the cold metal railing. "But what about me?" she murmured. "Who takes care of me if this goes wrong?" Back at the farm, Ethan tried to keep busy. He went to the barn, checked tools that didn't need checking, walked through the fields without direction. Everything felt too slow. Time refused to move. Every minute without a reply weighed heavier than the last. He imagined Grace driving alone, imagined her stopping along the road, imagined her listening to his message with eyes full of tears or anger. He didn't know which hurt more. "I'll accept any answer," he said out loud, "just not silence." But the silence remained. Grace got back into the car and drove on for a few more miles. The phone stayed untouched beside her. She knew that this reply couldn't be rushed. It wasn't just a message, it was a decision. Early afternoon, she stopped again, this time at a simple diner. She sat by the window, ordered coffee, and watched people walk by. Everyone seemed certain of where they were going. It made her smile faintly, bitterly. She picked up the phone again, typed. "Ethan," deleted it, typed again. "I heard your message." She stopped. The cursor blinked. Grace took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She thought of the woman who arrived at the farm full of caution. She thought of the woman who left full of pain. She thought of the woman she was now, trying to learn how to choose herself. She deleted everything again, paid for the coffee, and left. The afternoon stretched on, and with it the tension. The silence between them began to take shape, like a bridge suspended in the air, waiting for someone to take the first step. As the sun began to sink, Grace parked the car somewhere she recognized instantly. The road leading back to Willow Creek was right there. She turned off the engine and stared at the rusted sign bearing the town's name. Her heart raced. Her throat tightened. "This isn't an answer," she whispered. "But maybe it's a beginning." She picked up the phone, typed more slowly this time, didn't send it. She slipped the phone into her bag, started the car again, and stayed still for a few seconds, staring at the sign. The silence was still there, but now it felt filled with something that hadn't existed before. Possibility. Grace kept the car parked longer than necessary. The Willow Creek sign stood just ahead, slightly crooked, its paint worn by time. It was only a rusted piece of metal with a name on it, but in that moment it seemed to carry the full weight of a life she had tried to leave behind. The engine, still running, vibrated beneath her hands. She closed her eyes. "Just one step," she murmured. "One step at a time." It wasn't a promise to return for good. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even full hope. It was simply the decision not to run from herself. Grace took a deep breath and pressed the accelerator. The car moved forward slowly, passing the sign that marked the city limits. Willow Creek unfolded before her as if it had never changed. The same quiet streets, the same modest houses, the same welcoming silence that once frightened her. Now, the silence felt different. She drove slowly, taking everything in with new eyes. The small grocery store, the white church where she had gotten married, the corner cafe. Each place awakened memories, some tender, some painful, but none of them stopped her. For the first time, it felt as though she was moving through the town without fear of what she felt. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Ethan sensed that something had changed. He couldn't explain it. There was no message, no call, and yet the day felt heavy with expectation, like the air before a storm. Ethan walked through the fields, trying to focus on his work, but his mind refused to stay still. Grace still hadn't replied. Even so, he didn't regret the message. "I spoke," he repeated to himself. And that already changes everything. Late in the afternoon, Grace pulled over at the edge of the road that led to the farm. That road. She turned off the engine and stared ahead. The dirt path looked narrower than she remembered, as if it demanded courage to be crossed. There were no signs there, no guarantees, only the memory of everything that had been lived. She didn't drive in right away. She stepped out of the car and stood still, letting the wind touch her face. The smell of earth, fields, and distant animals washed over her, bringing a surge of emotions that almost made her turn back. "I didn't come back for you," she said softly. "I came back for me." Even so, his name echoed in her heart. Grace returned to the car and drove on. Every meter felt like a silent negotiation between reason and feeling. When she finally saw the house, her heart began to race. The lights were on. That surprised her. Ethan never turned them on when he was alone. She parked far enough away not to be seen right away. And waited. The house looked alive again. Ethan was on the porch when he felt something shift. He lifted his gaze toward the road instinctively, without knowing why. The sun was beginning to set, spreading golden tones across the sky. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. Then he saw it. A car, parked. His heart pounded. He didn't run, he didn't call out. He just stood there trying to contain the flood of emotions threatening to pull him under. Part of him feared it was someone else. Another part of him knew. Grace opened the car door, but didn't step out right away. She looked at the house once more, the porch, the door, the windows. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was. She took a deep breath and stepped out. Her feet touched the ground carefully, as if the soil might give way beneath her. She walked a few steps, then stopped. Ethan could see her clearly now. The evening light framed her hair, her tired face, her attentive eyes. They looked at each other from a distance. Neither spoke. It wasn't the silence of separation. It was the silence of recognition. Grace felt her legs tremble. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she should say anything. Everything felt too large for small words. Ethan took one step forward, then another. He stopped. He respected the space between them. "You didn't reply," he said, his voice low, controlled. "I needed to get here first," Grace answered. Her words came out steadier than she expected. Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand." And for the first time, Grace believed that he truly did. The sun disappeared behind the fields as they stood there, facing each other, without promises, without final decisions. Just two tired adults, learning how not to run. Grace knew this wasn't the end of the road, but it was, without a doubt, the first step back. And in that moment, that was enough. Night fell slowly over the farm. The sky darkened into deep shades of blue, and the first stars began to appear, shy as if watching from a distance what was about to unfold. The house remained lit, but neither of them seemed willing to cross the doorway. Grace and Ethan stood there on the porch, separated by just a few steps. and by years of swallowed words. A soft wind blew through Grace's hair, carrying the scent of earth and old wood. That porch had witnessed so many silences that now it seemed to demand a conversation, one of those that change everything. But it didn't come. Grace crossed her arms, more for protection than for warmth. Her heart was pounding, but not racing like before. Now it beat heavy. Careful. "You can come in," Ethan said, breaking the silence. She nodded, but took a moment before moving. They went inside. The house felt different, too tidy, too organized, as if he had tried to control the space because he couldn't control what he felt. Grace noticed the details immediately. The clean table, the lights on, the scent of freshly made coffee. "You didn't have to," she began, gesturing toward the house. "I know," he interrupted softly, "but I wanted to." They sat at the table facing each other, the same table where so many meals had been eaten in silence, where Grace had waited countless times for him to say something that never came. Now the silence was there again, thicker. Ethan rested his forearms on the table, fingers intertwined. He looked at Grace, then looked away, took a deep breath. "I rehearsed this conversation so many times," he confessed. Grace felt a tightness in her chest. "Me too," she replied quietly. They held each other's gaze for a moment. There was expectation. There was fear. There was everything that needed to be said. And still, nothing came out. "When you left," Ethan began, then stopped. Grace waited. The silence filled the space between them once more. "When you left," he repeated at last, "I realized I always speak too late." Grace felt tears rise, but she stayed steady. "And I realized," she answered, "that I always waited too long." The words hung in the air. They weren't accusations, they were truths. Ethan ran a hand over his face, visibly exhausted. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. "Maybe that's the problem," Grace said gently. "You always wait for the perfect moment, and it never comes." He closed his eyes for a second. "I was afraid," he said, "afraid of losing you the way I lost Claire, afraid of feeling everything all over again." The name hit Grace hard, but she didn't step back. "And I was afraid," she replied, "of disappearing while trying to save you." They looked at each other. This was the conversation that should have happened months ago, but something was still missing. It wasn't courage, it was surrender. Ethan opened his mouth to continue, but a distant thunder echoed outside. The storm was approaching slowly, as if the sky itself mirrored the tension inside the house. Grace stood up. "I didn't come back to fix everything today," she said. "I came back because I needed to face what I felt, and I did." Ethan stood up as well. "So, is this goodbye?" he asked quietly. Grace hesitated. "No," she answered, "but it's not a new beginning either." He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Tonight," she said, "just tonight." There was no promise in her answer, only a pause. They went upstairs in silence. The bedroom looked exactly the same, tidy, untouched. The space between the sides of the bed was still there, visible, almost symbolic. Grace placed her bag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night, Grace." He turned off the light and stepped away, leaving her alone in the room. Ethan went into the bedroom next door, closing the door carefully, as if any sound could shatter something far too fragile. Alone, Grace lay down, staring at the ceiling. The conversation that never happened now hovered between them like a ghost, unspoken, unresolved, but present. On the other side of the wall, Ethan was also awake, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of everything that still hadn't been said. The storm began outside. Rain fell hard, pounding the roof, the windows, the dry soil of the fields. Each thunderclap seemed to mark the time they had lost. Grace closed her eyes. Ethan did the same. The conversation didn't happen, but they both knew. After that night, pretending would no longer be possible. The storm arrived without asking for permission. The first thunderclap tore through the sky like a warning, making the windows of the house tremble softly. The rain followed immediately, heavy, relentless, pounding against the roof of the farmhouse as if it wanted to break through everything that was still too solid. Grace woke up to the sound. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, listening to the wind howl outside. For a brief moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came back. The road, the return, the silence, Ethan in the room next door. This wasn't just an ordinary storm. She could feel it. She rose slowly and walked to the window. The rain fell at an angle driven by strong winds. The trees bent, and the fields, usually so steady, looked fragile under the force of nature. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. On the other side of the wall, Ethan was awake too. He had sat on the edge of the bed as soon as the thunder echoed, his eyes fixed on the closed door. Storms always unsettled him, not because of the noise, but because of what they stirred inside. The past never felt closer than on nights like this. He took a deep breath, trying to anchor himself in the present. Grace was there, in the house, just a few meters away, and yet she felt farther than ever. Another thunderclap, closer. The lights flickered. Grace took a step back instinctively. Her heart raced again. It wasn't fear of the storm itself. It was the build-up, the exhaustion, everything still trapped inside her. The lights went out. The house plunged into darkness. "Damn!" Ethan murmured, getting up immediately. He stepped into the hallway, guided only by memory. He opened Grace's bedroom door carefully. "Grace!" he called, his voice steady but low. She turned quickly at the sound of his name. "I'm here," she answered. Another flash of lightning lit up the room for a second, revealing both their faces. The shock was brief, but enough to break something invisible between them. "The power's out," Ethan said. "I'll get some flashlights." I'm fine," she replied, but her voice sounded less steady than she intended. Ethan noticed. He didn't comment. He returned minutes later with 2 flashlights. He handed one to Grace, keeping a respectful distance, honoring the space she still seemed to need. "Storms like this usually last," he explained, "sometimes all night." Grace nodded. They sat down, each in a different corner of the room, like strangers sharing the same shelter. The rain hit hard, creating a constant, almost hypnotic sound. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore, it was tense. "Do you always wake up during storms?" Grace asked, breaking the silence. Ethan took his time before answering. "Always," he said finally. She waited. He knew she would. "Claire!" he began, then stopped. Grace took a deep breath. "You don't have to," she said. "I do," he replied with quiet firmness. "Even if you don't stay." She looked at him, surprised by his tone. "She died on a night like this," Ethan continued. "Heavy rain, slippery road. I should have gone to get her. I should have insisted. But I thought everything would be fine." The sound of the rain seemed to soften for a moment, as if the world itself was listening. "Since then," he went on, "I learned how to stay silent, because talking didn't bring her back, feeling didn't bring her back." Grace felt her chest tighten. "But it pushed me away from myself," he finished. "And from you." She lowered her gaze, feeling his words touch wounds that still hurt. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," Grace said at last. "I left because I was starting to lose myself." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know." Thunder echoed again, strong enough to shake the windows. Grace took a deep breath, her body reacting before her mind. Without realizing it, she moved a little closer. Ethan noticed. He didn't step away. "I don't want to run anymore," he said quietly. "Not from the past, not from you, but I don't know how to do this the right way." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears. "I don't know either," she confessed. "I just know I can't go back to what it was before." Silence settled between them again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was acceptance. Another flash of lightning lit the room, and for a brief second they saw each other as they truly were. Tired, imperfect, human. The storm continued outside, loud, wild, uncontrollable. But inside the house, something was beginning to calm. Grace set the flashlight down on the table and took a deep breath. "Maybe," she said carefully, "this night isn't about fixing everything." Ethan nodded. "Maybe it's just about stopping the escape." She looked at him one more time. And on that stormy night, with no promises and no clear endings, they both knew something had changed, not outside, but inside them. The storm had passed. Grace realized this before she even opened her eyes. There was no longer the heavy sound of rain against the roof, no wind howling through the cracks of the house. The morning silence was different from the silence of the night before. It was lighter, careful, almost respectful. She remained lying there for a few seconds, breathing slowly, as if afraid that any movement might undo that fragile moment. The night had been too intense. Ethan's words still echoed in her mind, the confession, the past, the pain he had carried in silence for so many years. For the first time, Grace felt she hadn't just been a spectator in his story, she had been invited inside. She sat up and ran a hand over her face. The room was bathed in soft light coming through the window. The sky, now clear, seemed to ask for calm after the chaos. On the other side of the house, Ethan was awake too. He had risen early, as always, but that morning his body felt heavier, not from physical exhaustion, but from emotion. The conversation from the night before hadn't solved everything, he knew that, but it had broken something that needed to be broken a long time ago. The silence. Ethan went to the kitchen and put water on to boil. The simple act of making coffee felt different, less automatic, more intentional. He looked around as if seeing the house with new eyes, not as a lonely refuge, but as a space that could perhaps be shared again. When Grace came down the stairs, he heard her before he saw her. Her steps were light, hesitant. Ethan turned slowly. "Good morning," he said. Grace replied with a small smile. "Good morning." The words were simple, but they carried everything that still hadn't been said. They stood there for a few seconds in silence, watching each other, as if confirming that the other was still there. "I made coffee," Ethan said, breaking the moment. "Thank you," Grace replied. They sat at the table facing each other, but without the tension from before. The silence no longer felt like a threat. It was simply space. Grace held the warm mug between her hands. "The storm was strong," she commented. "It was," Ethan agreed. "It knocked down some fences. I'll need to fix them later." She nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes things need to break," she said softly, "so we can see what's still worth keeping." Ethan looked at her carefully. "I thought a lot after you went upstairs," he confessed, "about everything I didn't say, about how I confused silence with protection." Grace took a deep breath. "And I thought about how I confused patience with erasing myself," she replied. There was no accusation there, only recognition. After coffee, Grace stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of wet earth. The fields shimmered in the morning light, as if nature itself had been washed overnight. Ethan watched her from a distance. She looked different, stronger, less broken. "I'm going for a walk," Grace said as she put on her shoes. "I need to think." "That's okay," he replied. "I'll be here." She nodded and walked down the dirt road, leaving light footprints on the still damp ground. Each step seemed to help her organize her thoughts. She didn't have definite answers. She didn't know if she would stay. She didn't know if she would leave for good. But for the first time, she didn't feel rushed. On the other side of the fields, Ethan began repairing one of the fallen fences. Working with his hands had always helped him think. As he adjusted the wood, he felt something inside him being rebuilt too, slowly, carefully. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't a happy ending. It was a beginning. When Grace returned, the sun was already higher in the sky. She stopped near Ethan and watched him for a few seconds before speaking. "I still need time," she said. He set the tool down and looked at her. "I know," he replied. "And this time, I'll respect that." Grace felt a quiet sense of relief at his words. "I'm not promising to stay," she added, "but I'm also not promising to leave today." Ethan nodded. "That's already more than I've had in a long time." They exchanged a long look, filled with unresolved things, but also with something new. Honesty. The morning moved on calmly. The storm was behind them. And among the remnants of chaos, Grace and Ethan were beginning to understand that rebuilding didn't mean going back to what they were before. It meant creating something different, more true, more human. Time didn't make a sound when it began to exist between them. There was no promise, no formal agreement, no embrace-sealing decisions, only a silent understanding that nothing could be rushed. Grace realized this as she folded a few clothes in the bedroom. She wasn't unpacking her bag. She wasn't leaving either. The clothes stayed there, neatly arranged, as if they mirrored exactly how she felt, staying without being bound. Outside, Ethan worked in the fields, but with less urgency than usual. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to control the entire day. The work was still there. The farm, too. But something inside him had slowed down. When Grace stepped onto the porch, she found him leaning against the fence, watching the horizon. "I was thinking of going into town tomorrow," she said, breaking the silence. "I need to take care of some things of my own." Ethan nodded. "I can take you." Grace looked at him for a moment. "I'd rather go alone," she replied gently. "It's not distance, it's space." He took a deep breath and nodded again. "I understand," he said, and this time she believed him. They walked back toward the house together, keeping a comfortable distance, not cold, not defensive, just respectful. It was strange how that felt more intimate than any forced closeness. They sat down for lunch, talked about simple things, the weather, the work, small details of routine. Neither of them mentioned the future or the past. It was a conscious pause between everything that had been and everything that still might be. "I don't want you to stay out of guilt," Ethan said suddenly. "Not out of pity. Not because you think I'll fall apart if you leave." Grace looked at him carefully. "I know," she replied, "and I don't want to stay out of fear or leave out of pride." The words didn't weigh them down. They settled. After lunch, Grace went for another walk through the fields. She observed everything more closely now, the details, the sounds, life moving on there, independent of human conflicts. She stopped near the old tree, the one Claire used to care for. She sat in its shade and closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel jealousy toward Ethan's past. She felt respect, understanding, maybe because now he no longer hid it. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed on the porch, watching her from a distance. He didn't call out to her. He didn't move closer. That, too, was part of their decision. To give time, to give space, to give a chance to what was real. By late afternoon, Grace returned with a calmer expression. "I'm going to stay a few days," she said. "Just a few." Ethan didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. "Thank you for telling me." "It's not a favor," she replied. "It's a choice." They spent the rest of the day in shared silence. That night they had dinner together again, then each went to their own room. There were no expectations, no frustration. There was respect. Lying in bed, Grace stared at the ceiling, feeling something rare, peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time no one was trying to sweep anything under the rug. On the other side of the wall, Ethan was awake too. But unlike before, he wasn't fighting the silence. He was living with it. The time they had decided to give wasn't a promise of a happy ending. It was a commitment to truth. And that night, that felt like enough. Nothing was said that morning. And yet, everything changed. Grace woke up early, before the sun fully reached the fields. The house was still asleep. The silence was gentle, almost welcoming, so different from the silence that once suffocated her. She got up slowly, walked to the window and opened the curtain. The day was born simply, no storms, no omens, no promises. She realized she liked that. In the kitchen, Ethan was already awake, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. He prepared coffee in silence, attentive to his movements, as if he wanted to respect the new, invisible territory that had formed between them. When Grace entered, he saw her reflected in the glass. "Good morning," he said, without turning around right away. "Good morning," she replied. There was no awkwardness, no expectation of a deep conversation so early in the day. Just two people sharing the same space with more care than before. They sat at the table, each with their own mug. The sun began to light the room, drawing soft shadows on the walls. Grace noticed small details she had once missed. The way Ethan held his mug, how he breathed before speaking, how present he seemed. "I'm going to work on the fence today," he said casually. "If you want to walk through the fields, feel free." Grace nodded. "Thank you." It was strange how that word, spoken so simply, sounded more honest than any grand promise. She spent the morning organizing a few things around the house, not as the owner, not as a guest, just as someone occupying the space without trying to shape it. She folded cloths, opened windows, let the air move freely. Outside, Ethan worked in silence. From time to time, he looked toward the house, not to watch her, just to make sure she was still there, without demands, without fear. At noon, Grace brought water out to the field. She approached carefully, without interrupting. "You forgot this," she said, handing him the bottle. "Thank you," Ethan replied, surprised and grateful. They stood there for a few seconds, side by side, observing the work done. "You've always been good at this," she said. "At building things." He smiled faintly. "It's easier than dealing with feelings." Grace didn't argue. She simply nodded. In the afternoon, they walked together to the barn. They didn't talk much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a chosen one. Grace realized she was beginning to trust not the future, but the present. The way Ethan didn't try to justify himself all the time. The way he accepted her need for space without interpreting it as rejection. Ethan, in turn, was learning something new. Staying didn't mean losing. Loving didn't have to be synonymous with immediate pain. When the sun began to set, they sat on the porch. "I thought a lot today," Grace said, breaking the silence. Ethan looked at her, attentive but calm. "About what?" "About how I always believed love needed guarantees, promises, plans, and how that made me accept less than I deserved." He nodded thoughtfully. "And I always believed that promising something was too dangerous," he replied, "because promises can be broken." Grace smiled softly. "Maybe we're learning the wrong way." but arriving at the same place. The sky turned shades of orange and pink. The fields looked peaceful, as if they knew nothing of it all. "I don't know where this is going," she said. "Neither do I," Ethan answered, "but I know where I am now." Grace looked at him. "And where is that?" "Here," he said, "not hiding." She took a deep breath. "Then I'll stay a little longer." It wasn't an eternal commitment. It wasn't a definitive return. It was an honest step. They remained there until night fully fell. No touching, no promises, no pressure. What was beginning between them came with no guarantees, but it came with something they had never had before: choice. Time didn't change everything all at once, and maybe that was the greatest surprise of all. The days that followed passed without grand announcements, without definitive declarations, without promises echoing across the fields. Life simply continued, and for the first time, that didn't feel like too little. Grace began to see the farm differently, no longer as the setting of a strange agreement, nor as the place where she had been pushed into a loveless marriage. That space now breathed quiet possibilities. She helped where she could, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she wanted to. She learned the schedules, the small rituals, the rhythm of the land. She discovered she liked the smell of morning, the distant sounds of the animals, the open sky that seemed to ask for nothing in return. Ethan, in turn, changed without realizing he was changing. He spoke more. Not a lot, but enough. He learned to stay in difficult conversations instead of running from them. He learned to look at Grace without fearing being truly seen. The past still existed, but it no longer commanded every move he made. At night, sometimes they sat together on the porch. Other times, each remained within their own silence, and that, too, was allowed. One day, Grace received a message on her phone, a reminder of the life she could return to, of the road that was still open. She read it, sighed, and didn't reply. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because, in that moment, staying felt just as legitimate as leaving. Ethan noticed. "You seem at peace," he said, as they walked through the fields at sunset. Grace thought for a few seconds before answering. "I think I'm learning that peace isn't certainty," she said. "It's presence." He nodded, feeling the weight and beauty of her words. "I've always been afraid of losing," he admitted. "And because of that, I was never fully present anywhere." Grace stopped walking and looked at him. "And now?" Ethan took a deep breath. "Now I stay," he said, even without knowing the ending. She smiled. Not the smile of someone who had won, but of someone who had understood. That night, the house felt more alive, not because of noise, but because the tension was gone. They shared dinner, laughed at something simple, noticed details that had once gone unseen. They didn't sleep together. They didn't seal promises. They didn't say forever. But before going to their rooms, Ethan stopped in the hallway. "Grace," he called, his voice steady but calm. She turned around. "Thank you for not leaving when you discovered who I truly was." Grace stepped closer. "And thank you for not running away when you realized I might stay." They looked at each other for a long moment. Intense, honest, real. And for the first time, there was no lie between them. The marriage that began as an agreement without love had become something that didn't yet need a name. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a guarantee. It was daily choice. It was care. It was presence. The next morning, the sun rose as it always had over those fields. The town remained there, watching from a distance. The past stayed where it had always been. But Grace and Ethan were exactly where they chose to be. Not because they needed to be, but because they wanted to be. And this is how the story ends. Not with eternal promises, but with sincere choices, made one day at a time. If this story touched you in any way, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next narratives. Leave a like. It really helps this channel grow and allows these stories to reach even more hearts. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and which part of this story impacted you the most. Thank you for staying until the end. More stories are already on the way. See you in the next chapter.